Charleston is a 17th century vernacular building, about halfway between Brighton and Eastbourne. And it's very close to the county town of Lewes. It's very, very rural, as you would have experienced when you went there, but still very close to these sort of centres of quite urban areas. And so from 1916, it was the home for Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, their rural home for most of that time. Duncan Grant and David Garnett, his lover at the time, were both conscientious objectors, so they went there to work on a nearby farm, and Vanessa Bell there to look after the house. After the end of the war, they kept the house on as a summer place, so they would have resumed their urban lives, had the big studios in London, had a house and a studios in the south of France, would come to Charleston in the summer. And then with the advent of the Second World War, they made Charleston their primary home. This time Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, and Vanessa Bell's husband Clive Bell were the main residents of the house. And it was their primary home from there until their various deaths, but they still maintained places in London. So Vanessa Bell died in 1961, Clive Bell in 1964, and then Duncan Grant in 1978. So over that period of time, there's like 60 years of life in there, 60 years of decoration. Charleston is very much it's a bit of a Cinderella, so their decorative schemes in London and their commissions were quite often photographed. They were published in Architectural Review. They were in Vogue, and they're kind of a bit more dramatic, a bit more sort of theatrical. Charleston is it gets more cozy, more homely. It's very much more immediate decorations. And Charleston itself isn't photographed. It isn't reproduced in magazines. You sometimes see it in paintings, and it's sometimes referenced in paintings, but it was very much a private space, a family space for most of that time. So it doesn't really come... so there we go, there's Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant. It doesn't really come to prominence until the 1960s. So this is an article by Richard Morfett from 1967 in Apollo magazine. And this is the first kind of appraisal of Charleston as an important historic space. And not just for the decorations and for the art and the design that it contains, but also as a space where the Bloomsbury Group were and the things that happened there and the things that were discussed there. So like a complete whole encapsulation of that Bloomsbury aesthetic and lifestyle. And then that point, there sort of Charleston became much more photographed. This is a series of photographs taken in Duncan Grant's 90th birthday in 1975. So you can see the studio at Charleston and all the clutter and all the things that were in there. So Duncan Grant died in 1978, and then there was this sense that the house should be saved, that it was an important thing to be saved. Then after some sort of indecision and a campaign was started to save the house. Now by this time it was in quite a really bad state of repair, and a lot of restoration was needed to do it. £1 million was raised in 1980, which there'd been a huge amount then, before the Heritage Lottery Fund and all those sort of things. So a lot of American money, thank you America. Lots of different funds were raised. And the freehold of the house was purchased from the Firle estate, which surrounds it, and then the process of restoration could begin. And there was a lot of restoration, not just the fabric of the house, but the different things that had happened to the house over the preceding few years. So since Vanessa Bell died in 1961, and Duncan Grant's death in 78, there had been some quite intrusive changes to the house. So this is Clive Bell's study, which is very similar to how you would have seen it on a recent visit. And then this is it in the late 1960s, which is very similar to how it looks now. This is from a film made in 1969 called Duncan Grant at Charleston, which is a really interesting evidence of how the house looked like. And he also walks around with the camera and tells you about the things in the room and where things were, and all sorts of different stories. And then this was what the room looked like in the 1970s. So in 1971, Charleston's long-serving housekeeper Grace Higgins retired, and another couple brought in to look after the house, but it didn't really work, and so they were allowed to stay living in Grace Higgins's accommodation, and they had the house kitchen. So a new kitchen was created in what was Clive Bell's study for Duncan Grant and for Duncan Grant's guests. So you see there's a little cooker with a Calagas bottle, and just all sorts of things that are now in our collection, sort of hanging on the walls. You still got Vanessa Bell's decorations that she did in 1916, 17. You've got the fireplace decorations that she did in the 1920s. You've got Duncan Grant's door that he did in 1917. But it's all surrounded by these sort of pots and pans and cups and saucers. And I imagine a very greasy space as well. Sort of all the different cooking effects of the cooking. There's one where you can see how much the paint has peeled away from the fire and from the cooking and stuff. So that was a major. So the trust, when it was formed, was faced with this process of kind of recreating this authenticity, of taking the house back to how they felt it should be presented to the public, the sort of the period of time that they thought it was appropriate for it to be seen. So the period of time that was appropriate was the late 50s, so before Vanessa Bell's death, when all the key decorative schemes had been done, when all the key people were living there, when we had a real memory of what the house was like, what was in there, when we actually had most of the objects. So the family were very generous in donating the furniture and paintings and ceramics and all these sort of things, the textiles, to the trust to recreate these spaces. I'm going to focus on one particular room, so the dining room, which is a real show, one of the showpieces of the house with this incredible wallpaper. This is how it's seen pretty much today, probably not today, on a sunny day. This is the earliest visual representation of it. This is a painting from 1919 by Duncan Grant. It shows Vanessa Bell painting a picture on the left and David Garnett writing on the right. And you can see it. It's quite a dowdy room. It's whitewashed. So the house, when the artist moved into the house, it had been a guest house, and the walls were covered in very floral wallpapers. So the first thing that they do was have the whole house kind of whitewashed in this wonderful grey, soft grey whitewash to create almost like a blank canvas. Even though they didn't know that they would be spending the rest of their lives at this place, they were almost sort of preparing it for that 60 years of creativity. But you can see there's this like mean little fireplace on the right. The inglenook had been filled in, and there's different references. So we've still got these chairs. The table is now in the kitchen. There's quite a few objects that are still in the collection. This is a photograph taken by Barbara Bagnall in the late 1930s. You can see the walls are quite white, clear. It's quite a mundane looking room, actually. I was looking at it last night. There's electric light, so you know it's the late 30s because they didn't have electricity installed till the late 30s. You've got the Vanessa Bell table with the original decoration, and the one you would have seen at Charleston was a later one done in the 1950s. We've got some pieces of ceramics. We've got Vanessa Bell's teacup designs for Foley from 1934, and an Omega chair stuck up against the wall. And we've still got several of the paintings in the collection. And then by this point, the inglenook had been excavated and relined with bricks. And you can see that in there. This is the first time that Charleston was actually seen in the press. This is an article from the Sunday Telegraph magazine in 1964. And it coincided with an exhibition by Duncan Grant called Duncan Grant in His Circle. And it was, so Duncan Grant was an incredibly successful artist, particularly in the 20s and the 30s and into the Second World War, exhibiting all the time, selling all the time, getting lots of commissions. And then after the war, his reputation, his sales declined. They became very fashionable. He had a retrospective at the Tate in 1959, and the review in the Times said, exhibition of an artist now in disfavor, which is quite a damning review. But by 1964, there was this new interest in his work and in the work of British modern artists. And he's, Charleston is a past that lingers, which is a lovely idea. And you see Duncan Grant in the dining room eating his breakfast or his lunch actually, off a famous woman dinner plate. You see the decorations behind that were done in the Second World War. And you can also see for the first time in print the studio, and there are also other areas of the building. This is a still from the 1969 film Duncan Grant at Charleston, so just a few years later than the previous article. And again, I mean, everything we have in the collection now, all the plates on the mantelpiece, the 2 jugs and the pot on the piano, the painting we have in our collection, which if we sometimes hang there and we sometimes hang in another room, the table, the chairs, even the pots on the table, the chairs in the Ingle Nook, everything is now in the collection at Charleston and is sort of in that location. There are also different photographs taken. It was photographed by English Heritage, I think, in the 60s. It was photographed by young students, so by then people were visiting Duncan Grant and visiting Charleston and taking photographs. So there's quite a big record of the house from that period. This is just a family snapshot of Duncan Grant and his friend Paul Roche at the dining room table. And then another one. And then this is the house, this is the room as it looked like without the furniture in. So after the trust took it on, you can see the amount of work that was needed. It's an incredibly damp house. It's a constant worry looking after the house. It's all of these surfaces, the highly decorated surfaces were removed. So all these wallpapers were taken off. And there's a nice picture of a very patient paper conservator literally peeling away each little bit. All the different layers of wallpapers that were behind the top layer were peeled away. Then when it reached the surface, the decorated surface was attached to a conservation grade lining paper. And then once the house had been replastered and repaired and was completely dry, the papers were rehung and then areas of loss were filled in. So it's very much kind of trying to recreate that authentic original design. These are some of the this is from the spare bedroom, but some of the papers that were saved from the conservation process. And then during the restoration in the 70s, Anne Olivia Bowell, so Vanessa Bowell's daughter-in-law, so the wife of Quentin Bell, created almost like this wonderful visual resource. So she took photos of the house in the late 50s and early 60s, and then was able to use those in the 80s as a reference for the restoration of the project of the house. So these are 1960, and we can see the placing of all the furniture and the placing of the ceramics and where things were. I mean, we move things around quite often sometimes, but most of that is pretty much as you see it today. And that's how it is most recently. So we have a really strict hanging policy in the house, which is part of maintaining that authenticity. So we have an inventory of paintings, so where everything was in the 40s and another one in the 50s. And this informs what we move paintings around, we lend stuff, we borrow stuff, we acquire things. But what we hang in the house is really, we're really strict. We used to have a hanging house group, but over the years, Giles Waterfield was in that, Olivia Bell, but those people are now gone, and so it's up to us, up to me to take on that role of what is authentic, what is not. It's a kind of precarious position because it's the person who follows me is sort of like, what are they going to do? But we do try and keep it as tight as possible, and which means there isn't any space in the house for sort of very difficult to introduce different stories. There's lots of different stories around the group, around the artists that we want to tell, we want to explore. So quickly, onto our exhibition spaces. So this is the exhibition we've got at the moment, Omega Workshops, Post-Impressionist Living Omega Workshops. And this allows us to take things out the house, like the screen, like the chairs, borrow things, textiles and paintings and all sorts of things, and create different dialogues and different stories. It allows us to, so this one, something you can never do in the house. This is a painting by Edward Wolfe. It's got a Gaudio Breshka cat, a Roger jug, and an Omega Workshop book in it. And we've hung the painting in the house forever and ever, and we've got the jug in our collection. But the cat, we would never show like a study for a painting next to that painting because it would look too art history, art historical. It wouldn't look like something you would do at home. So the galleries give us the opportunity to take those different stories. This is a new painting. It's got a lot of text by it in the house shoe, relying on the guides, our brilliant guides that take people around, or the stewards on a Sunday to impart that information. I guess in the gallery, I get control over what's written, so that's quite nice. There we go. And at the end, okay, this is an advert for the show. So basically what it is the house maintains this kind of aura of authenticity. The exhibition space gives us a space for taking liberties in some places, sort of exploring different angles, exploring different stories, bringing different artists together, working with contemporary artists. Something we wouldn't do in the house is do interventions in the spaces, because the narrative and the personality of the artist is so strong. I wouldn't want to interrupt that narrative. But in other parts of the sites, like in the galleries, we can take on all sorts of different themes and different subjects. So now you'll all want to come and see Charleston and Post-Impressionist Living. Thank you.